It's my pleasure to introduce today's opening keynote entitled EdTech on a Learning Curve. And so please welcome to the stage co-founders of EdTechX and respectively chairman and operating partner of IBIS Capital, Charles McIntyre and Benjamin Vedrenne-Cloquet.
Good morning, and thank you again also for being here. So, as you know, as Jamie introduced us, I'm Charles McIntyre, and with me here today is my friend and colleague who I've been on this EdTech journey with, Benjamin Vedrenne-Cloquet.
Good morning, everyone. Delighted to see you back. Delighted to be unzoomed.
So, I think back to when we first launched EdTechX back in 2013, and we budgeted then on having 70 people coming to an event that we were hosting at the London Business School. And as we went through 100 tickets, LBS told us that they wouldn't have a room that would be big enough to host the event. But they said, don't worry, we have a relationship with another institution that's just round the corner and has a suitable hall for your event. Anyway, we duly went there, and we were all slightly surprised because the place that we all went to turned out to be the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. And so everybody had to walk past rather scary instruments as they went in to the hall. Anyway, looking back and what we are today, it's a great pleasure to be here, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you back in person to an in-person event, and consequently, I think we're just going to pause for a moment and ask each of you just to say hi and introduce yourself to the person immediately next to you, just as a way of returning to the real world. So, we know this always happens from previous occasions, is that trying to stop you talking is then the next problem. So we introduced the gong, but thank you, and it's very nice to have you here. As you all know from previous events, Benjamin and I provide an opening warm-up session which aims to share some of the key insights that we've acquired on our various EdTech adventures. Our event today is about the experience of learning. How do we make the learning process effective in a digital age? Not just extending the real world by digital delivery, but instead pushing the boundaries to areas and ways of learning that will provide us with an unforgettable experience, those precious moments of insight and teaching that stay with us a lifetime. And in that respect, we are, as the title of this particular talk is, EdTech is on a learning curve. Let me start with explaining a little of what we've been up to. An important element of building the ecosystem has been about joining the dots across the globe, with Asia and Africa experiencing huge, growing demand for skills acquisition. It has been great to bring together the four corners of the globe through the EdTechX platform. All in all, connecting over 20,000 people with an interest in education and training. And then if we layer on top of that, what we've been doing in providing insights, telling the stories of the movers and shakers in the industry, and providing predictions and projections of what's happening across the industry. And then there is our own track record. And in that respect, the most recent thing that we've done has been the business, or announcing the business combination for our NASDAQ-quoted SPAC that focuses on education and training. This is our second outing with a SPAC, having been pioneers with our first one. this time combining with Z-Space, a hugely exciting VR, AR business providing immersive content to the K-12 and workforce training market. But more about that later. So I also wanted just to link in our other side of our business, which is IBIS Capital, which has been super active, where in spite of COVID, we've been putting together EdTech deals right across the globe, from Australia to the Silicon Valley, and quite a lot of points in between, as you can see. This makes IBIS Capital, the business we founded over 20 years ago, one of the most active players in the sector, with deep sector knowledge and global connections, and we're always pleased to help businesses and their investors. To create a healthy ecosystem, we need the knowledge, the connections, the funding, and most importantly, the makers. The practitioners, the investors, the entrepreneurs, and the leaders. In other words, all of you who are here today. So a big thank you again for coming, and please do take time to connect with others during the course of the day, whether it's in person or using social media. So to lead us into the insights that we're going to share with you today, I'm going to hand you over to Benjamin.
Thank you, Charlie. Good morning, everyone. So where we left it, remember 2 years ago, we were at the heart of the pandemic. And it was a bit like in Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, the worst of times for the world, but the best of times for EdTech. And for those who were with us back in 2020, you may remember that we predicted this, a new EdTech adoption lifecycle, pre-COVID, EdTech mostly a thing for innovators and early adopters. Post-COVID, EdTech becomes mainstream. And it felt good, right? It felt good because all of us had waited for that moment for quite a long time, and we felt that the stars were aligned and that time had come for EdTech. And if you look at the growth of the market, it's still a long rising tide and rising even faster. So the education market will grow by 1.5 times. The EdTech market will grow by 2.5 times up to 2025. And what that means is that every new $10 spent in education, for every new $10 spent in education, $1 is spent in EdTech now. And that's how we measure velocity, and that's how we measure the rate of digital adoption in education. On the investment side, it's been literally a global funding fest. And I call this a bring your own unicorn party. It's been 3x the number of the amount of private funding in EdTech startups, and even 5x for India and European startups. 3x the number of unicorns, so we have 33 now, EdTech unicorn versus 11 pre-COVID. And India is a big provider of those, and for the first time we have 2 European EdTech unicorns, Go Students and Multiverse, so well done. And 3 times the number of IPOs in EdTech with market capitalization beyond $2 billion. So, as Bloomberg said back in the time, we were at a situation where we could face the biggest sustained mass experiment in online education ever. And so now, with hindsight, I would like to ask you a question. Do you think EdTech has delivered? And I think we're going to do this British Parliament way. So if you think that EdTech has delivered, says yeah. Has EdTech delivered? Okay. If you think EdTech has not delivered during the pandemic, says nay. Has EdTech delivered? Okay, so pretty balanced. Well, the truth is, EdTech has been on a learning curve. And let's look at how we did as an industry in terms of providing a quick fix to school closures and as an alternative to classroom. Let's see how we did as an industry in terms of solving the workforce challenges during the pandemic. And let's see how we did as an industry in a situation of crisis, how we did ethically. And so we were promised the greatest time for EdTech, but actually what we experienced was the most regressive use of tech. Classroom on Zoom. It's pretty much going back to scanning school books. And that's what it is from a technology standpoint. And from a academic standpoint, it's been a disaster. It has delivered very poor engagement and very poor efficacy. So EdTech is on the learning curve, and if you look at it, actually, if you look at the data, the world has accumulated during the pandemic a delay of 8.2 months in terms of learning. So a deficit in learning of 8.2 months, which is huge. And the variance you see across countries here is not explained by access to technology, but just by how long the schools have been closed. So, there is long-term effect to this, and we already see school dropouts on the rise, obesity on the rise, teenage pregnancy on the rise, mental health issues from students on the rise. And there is also an economic impact. A study of McIntyre predicted that if we don't remediate this unfinished learning gap, there will be a cost every year to the global economy of 0.9% of the global GDP, which is a lot of money, and it's basically equivalent to a war between Russia and Ukraine every year. So clearly, this first test has failed. Now, let's look on the workforce side. And on the workforce side, what we all faced, at least in the Western economies, is the concept of great resignation. I think we've all heard about it. And the question I have for you is, do you think it's pandemic-driven, or is it a long-term trend? And when you look at the data, it's actually not so great. It's just a long-term trend. And what we see is that this trend is fueled by a rising skill gap, which gives more clout to employees, a rising skill gap that is amplified what we call 5 Rs, which are structural factors. And so those 5 Rs are here, retirement and relocations. So workers are retiring in greater numbers and are not relocating so much. Reconsideration, workers are reconsidering their choice, their work-life balance, and their care duties. Reshuffling, workers are reshuffling across industries, and also reluctance. Because of pandemic fears or because of post-pandemic habits, they are reluctant to go back to in-person jobs. So EdTech did a bit to help on the skill gap, but obviously can't fix all those factors structurally. So sustained effort needed here as well. Now let's look on the business ethics side. How did we do as an industry when we faced a need for EdTech solution and when the world was in crisis? There's been a lot of reports of EdTech starting to be evil. For example, tutoring platforms using abusive marketing selling techniques, for example, also educational app providers stealing data. And I want to say, please, EdTech, don't be evil. Don't be evil because EdTech is not a money grab, right? It's not only a money grab. It's fine if it makes money, but it's more than this. And be careful because governments are watching and are worried about the use of big capital and big tech in education. And just to give you an example, in China, which was the most thriving EdTech ecosystem in the world, at some point, the government decided that it was too hot, too greedy, too big, and using the own words of Xi Jinping, saying it's a disorderly expansion of capital in EdTech. And what they've done is they basically overnight turned the entire sector into a non-for-profit sector, which was obviously a devastation for the investment level in the sector and also for the market capitalization of companies that were once the darlings of Wall Street in education. So EdTech, beware. EdTech is more than just business. It's also about efficacy, sustainability. And what I would like to do is now hand over to Charlie to tell you more about 2 exciting directions that we see for the future.
Thank you. Well, after the cold shower that Benjamin has just poured all over us about EdTech, let's try and find where the sunny uplands might be. And we think there are probably 2 key areas that are worth looking at. One is impact in ESG, and the other is experiential. Places of learning reflect the communities they serve. So as we add more and more environments of learning, we need to keep track of the societal impact at many levels. People talk about the digital Uberization of education as being a great thing because it allows us to access digital content in education much more easily and at a much lower cost. But equity in education is not like catching an Uber. It requires us to understand much more about the driver, the car, who made the car, what are the conditions of the road, where do the roads go, do we want to get to the place where the roads take us? All these things are the factors that are important as we look at education as it relates to a digital world. And in that context, we now need to start thinking about impact. And we now need to start thinking about impact right now, because this whole infrastructure is being built. And while it's being built, we need the implications of impact and ESG to be thought of not as an afterthought, but as a before thought. And so in that context, we have launched our own methodology, which we want to share with the EdTech ecosystem, which is to help us assess some of the important factors that are relevant as we build this digital world for education. These tools are available for everyone, and it will allow us to assess the hygiene of the world we want to create. This needs to become the new norm. So our action today is to ask you all to join on this particular journey. The next part of our journey here today is then to link into the other area that is of particular interest to us, experiential. We want to take you to the land of experiential learning. As we've said before at previous EdTech events, when digital goes mainstream, experiential becomes premium. And what do we mean by that? Well, as services become commoditized and ubiquitous, then we start to lose the sense of interaction and empathy. And these are the important aspects of why experiential and live becomes premium. And for us, we think this is the next normal, the next focus area. It may feel like an old normal in disguise, but this is the importance of thinking about us as human agents within the mix. And if you look at other industries, for example, media and entertainment, you'll see that despite a world of video streaming, we have the live experience as a concert in this example as being the premium environment that people want. If you take e-commerce, you look at what people are doing like Apple, trying to create town hall experiences to give a sense of connection. And then as we look at education and work, there should be no exception. The challenge for us is how to use technology to build on our desire for experience without dumbing down what we might have in the real world. For us, we think there are three key stages of digital transformation. And you may remember earlier when Benjamin was talking about the adoption cycle, and we went through the innovators, and then the early adopters, and then into the early majority. Well, this stage is what we would describe as we have diffusion. So we have widespread access to EdTech tools, like those from Khan Academy, or Duolingo, or Quizlet, Grammarly, etc. But this is just access. It may help, but it doesn't actually, in our view, take us forward. We then move to the next stage, which Benjamin started to describe, which we call supersedence. And this is where the digital world starts to replace some of our real-world activities. But again, as Benjamin pointed out, we see this as a danger zone because you end up with the risk, as we've seen, of just, for example, having Zoom classrooms, which ends up with a regressive experience. It doesn't build on using technology to take us to a new plane. And so, from our perspective, it's about how do we create a paradigm shift so that we actually use technology to actually raise our aspirations and experience in the digital environment. And for example, in this last picture on the right, what you can see is essentially an AR model of a NASA spacecraft in somebody's bedroom. Now, the fact that you can then access and feel and see what this is doing creates a sense of engagement and experience of wonder, which what we think is really at the heart of the learning process of creating an experience. So we've tried to bring these aspects of impact and experience together in the things that we are doing as Benjamin and I and our businesses that we're involved in. And just as an example, with our NASDAQ SPAC, we've agreed to donate a portion of the shares that we hold in that company to help fund digital inclusion. And that is under a wider initiative we're trying to create in the SPAC market called SPACs for Good, trying to make sure that there's ways of helping others within the overall ecosystem. We pioneered the first SPAC in EdTech, and we're now trying to pioneer this particular support for supporting equity within the EdTech environment. Our SPAC is now recently announced that it's combining, as I mentioned earlier, with zSpace, a company that is genuinely breaking through the screen to create these types of experiences. And to give you a very quick flavor, I will show you a short video. I will let you know that the CEO, Paul Kellenberger, is here today, and hopefully you might get a chance to meet him.
We did this through a range of innovations in hardware and software. These innovations have eliminated the barrier between digital content and people so that they can be immersed in content, touch it, experience it, and interact with it as if it were real.
So, what you just saw is a without glasses system that allows a social interaction with 3D objects in a very experiential way. And so from our perspective, this is a prime example of how to create a new sense of engagement and experience that takes learning to a new level. zSpace is already 94% of the top 100 school districts in the United States. So this is not just the beginning, this is on a pivot as it starts to become mainstream in the US. They are uniting education with the metaverse. And for us, these immersive technologies are going to be the game changers. We already can see in terms of the level of disruption in this graph on the screen is that education and workforce development are expected in combination to be the two largest forces after healthcare as impacting through VR and AR. And it's not going to be small. What's the expected overall market is going to be expected to be 250 billion by 2028. And if we look at the education end within that, 16 billion just by 2025. But the Eduverse is coming. So the question is that, for us, is seeing how that is going to work in practice. And I like to use a quote from Benjamin Franklin, which I think gives a flavor of what this all means. Tell me, and I forget. Teach me, and I remember. And that I see as the old school variant. That's the didactic classroom. The most important bit is that involve me, and I learn. And that is the experience that we're looking for. But can we build this Eduverse environment? Well, the work is underway, and there are examples. For Labster, which is another European company that has been hugely successful in this space, building virtual laboratories based out of Denmark, zSpace that I've just mentioned. But to make all this happen, we need massive processing power to be able to bring all the different parts together. Intel has suggested that we need a 1,000-fold increase in computing power just to be able to manage that. And it's going to be driven by AI, self-learning AI, that we mentioned back a few years ago at EdTechX, but at that stage it didn't have a name. Today, these are typically called foundation models, the base layer on which this huge computational capability will be built. So, from our perspective, the real issue then is going to be looking at these huge foundation models. Who are going to be the custodians of these educational gods? Who are going to be the gatekeepers? Are we going to be dependent on big tech to be able to be the ethics committee for deciding how and what we learn? Well, one of the pioneers within this arena, a gentleman called Dr. Thomas Furness, commented on this whole sector when he started to look at virtual reality. He himself is a pioneer in that space. He started his career designing the sophisticated interfaces for fighter jet cockpits. He then went to University of Southampton in the UK to do his PhD before going on to the University of Washington. And he certainly puts this as being on a knife edge. He likens the developments in virtual reality to the discovery and development of splitting the atom. His comment is that it can be used to be hugely helpful to humankind, but at the same time, it could be hugely dangerous to us. And the question that we ask ourselves is, how do we ensure that we don't get burnt in that process? Well, that brings us back to impact and ESG within the Eduverse, because we think that is the important role in terms of bringing some sort of order, some sort of equity within this new world that's being created. And to help that process in terms of our views how it should be developed, we think the important thing is it involves the design of these new platforms, this new content, these new layers of interaction by many. It needs to be accessible by all, and it needs to be open so that we can see how these things are being developed, so that we understand that there is no black box that conceals the origins of where and who's writing our history, or the ethics of our medicine, for example. Well, if we make these right choices, we can shift the paradigm, but the question is, where will that take us? And let me hand over to Benjamin, who's going to give you some insights as to where this might go.
So where does this lead us? And after the initial cold shower of my speech, I'm going to be a bit more optimistic. So I think where it leads us is to an augmented relationship with knowledge. And I want to share a story that we've been following for the past 5 years. For those who were with us in EdTechX 2018, you may remember this guy, Harry Yeff, aka Rips1. And Rips1 was a guest speaker at EdTechX, and is a recording artist, and is known to be the world's famous beatboxer. So let's listen to him for 20 seconds.
When I'm free and old, will I still be getting info? If the truth be told, I'm a sucker for that high. Trade, green. When I'm free and bold, will I still be getting info? One more time.
So not one more time. And at that stage, you might think, what the hell, right? And believe it or not, this gentleman performed this year at the World Economic Forum in Davos in front of the great leaders. And you might think at that stage, well, no wonder why the world is going banana. But let me tell you why. His team, together with neuroscientists and speech therapists, mostly from the University College of London, have collaborated to create an artificial intelligence program that visualizes his voice in sculptural forms, right? So they've created a digital sculpture of his voice using intensity, intonation, frequency of sounds. And through this augmented relationship with his voice, they have improved their understanding of how new pathways in the brain could be created to develop what we call expert system. Those connections in the brain that basically allow fluid reproduction, processing, and sequencing of sounds and language. And so this is now used in combination with artificial intelligence program to find new foundational models to cure speech therapy. And this gentleman here, Remy, which is a teenager who has visual and hearing impairments, through his beatboxing, and when he speaks, now he speaks with percussion, has improved dramatically his speech therapy. And the reason I like this story is because this is a story of an augmented relationship with human voice. enabled and amplified by technology that produce breakthrough in the way we learn. And the working assumption today is that we use only 20% of the potential of human voice. So think about what we could achieve with the remaining 80%. So all this is telling us one thing. Basic digital dissemination, basic digital replication may be what the world think of EdTech, and it may be what the world needed during the pandemic. But EdTech is much more. And my belief, and our belief here, is that we are at the very beginning. We are at the very beginning of a new experience of learning. And that's why we love EdTech. Welcome to EdTechX 2022.